Good morning everyone and welcome to the Green Stand here at COP26. I'm Liam Gouch and I work in our responsible business team, and I'm joined here today by my colleagues Nikki Pesharaju and Christine Liu. We're really excited to be here today to talk about some of the work that we've been doing over the last couple of years, looking at how we can make construction projects that we work on here in the UK more sustainable and lower the environmental impact of those projects. So you've probably heard over the last week or so a lot of talk around the government's net zero strategy, and specifically around how we're looking to decarbonise the energy sector by 2035. The scale of that challenge is huge, and just to give you an idea of that scale in terms of some figures, the proposal from the UK government around decarbonisation of the energy sector is looking to build out in the North Sea 40 gigawatts of offshore renewable power and significant amounts of nuclear and solar as well. And whilst we don't build that generation ourselves, National Grid's role in the low carbon energy transition is fundamental. We've got to build the infrastructure out to all that new renewable and low carbon generation to be able to bring it back onshore and into the grid so we can offer safe and reliable electricity across the UK. So we've got a few slides today. We're going to talk a little bit through some of our construction projects and through some of the work that we're doing in this area.
So to really bring to life what National Grid do, we've got one example, which is our Hinkley connection project, which is probably a great example of lots of different project teams coming together, our supply chain coming together to build these large multi-million pound infrastructure asset projects, all contributing towards this energy transition journey that National Grid's on. And to help bring it to life a little bit more in terms of what National Grid actually do, here's a short video to just try and paint the Hinkley project in a few numbers.
Brilliant. I think that's a really good video. It kind of shows a bit about the scale of some of these projects that we're doing. So this slide is titled Importance of Embodied Carbon. I think it's really important because when we tend to think of the environmental impact that we have as individuals, we tend to think of direct impact that we have. So I always use the example of something like a house. If we're thinking of the environmental impact our house has, we often think of the electricity and the energy that we use. So it might be the gas that we use to heat that house, or the electricity that we use to keep the lights on, or to power appliances. I think what we tend to think about probably less is the embodied carbon that goes into constructing that house in the first place. So things like, I guess, the bricks and mortar that go into building that house, glass and steel, maybe the roof, the kind of roof trusses and slates and things. And each of those materials has a really significant impact. So we take an example of something like a brick. Obviously there's the raw materials that go into making that brick, so something like clay and water, but also the materials that the processes that brick goes through to be made before it eventually comes to the construction site. So heating it up and drying it out and cutting it into pieces, all of those processes have an energy cost associated with them and a carbon impact, right through to transporting that to the final construction site for it to be built. And if we scale that up to, I guess, all of those materials that we talked about in that example, or scale it up again to something the size of Hinkley or London Power Tunnels, as this example on the screen is now, you can start to see that embodied carbon from these building materials and from the construction activities that we do is really significant, and quite often towards the operational emissions from things like the energy and the diesel used to house some of the equipment on site.
Yeah, and we've been measuring the embodied carbon of our construction designs for about 6 to 8 years, and during that time we've also worked with our supply chain to try and lower carbon. So we, in the last 2 years I'd say, we've really driven the supply chain to reduce carbon in construction. So when I think about what does low carbon construction look like, we thought we'd ask a few of our colleagues and see from them. So we'd just like to show a small video.
Sustainable construction means to me that we understand the carbon footprint of everything before we build it, and we push ourselves and the supply chain hard to make the right choices going forward.
It means appreciating that everything we build has a carbon cost and accepting that we're accountable for that.
For me, it's about taking ownership of our carbon emissions and working with our supply chain to achieve a low carbon future.
Low carbon construction means to me understanding the impact of everything that we build and the supply chain that make it happen.
So for me, it's all about us working together, being in a position where we work with our clients, our partners and our supply chain to be in a position where we create a greener future for future generations.
So I think that was a really great video there of some of our colleagues who are right at the heart of this energy transition, delivering this journey that National Grid's on. And I think it's really great to see them speak so candidly about what low carbon construction means to them. And what's interesting about this video is that it wasn't scripted at all, was it? And it's interesting to see certain themes crop up from exactly what these people have said in terms of what low carbon construction means to them. And I want to try and deep dive into some of these topic areas that have emerged. The first area is all around data and transparency. And this lends itself quite nicely into collaboration. So Christine, you mentioned earlier about collaborating with our supply chain, and that's just one of the many examples of collaboration that the low carbon construction project has gone through. And then lastly, it's about National Grid being accountable as a leader and, you know, showing the rest of our supply chain and other infrastructure clients how we go about achieving this low carbon construction journey. So on that note of data and transparency, Liam, you know, I'm going to throw this question at you. What exactly is the sort of data that we've got around our construction sites, and, you know, how are we using this to try and identify what our biggest areas of impact are?
So we've got lots of data, is the honest answer. We've been collecting it for probably about 6 years now. So over the last 5 or 6 years, we've collected carbon footprints from probably about 300 of our schemes, just over, I think, now. And we've been really able to use that data to identify where our carbon hotspots are. So this slide is really great because it illustrates where those carbon hotspots are. So on the left here, you've got a cable drum. So aluminium is one of our key hotspots. In the middle, you've got a substation site, and that's really illustrating the steel support structures that we use on our substation sites, but also in our overhead line towers. And then thirdly, you've got another substation site, but this is really to illustrate concrete. So we use concrete in lots of our construction activities. Here you've got an example of the bunds, which is what a lot of our equipment sit on, but we also use it, if you think back to that first video and the example of London Power tunnels, to build out concrete shafts for those tunnels, but also for things like temporary access roads and other temporary access for sites. So really important materials, and I guess the idea of this kind of data-driven approach that we take is really important because it allows us to understand better where we can leverage technology and innovation to be able to reduce our carbon footprint on a lot of these schemes. So I think concrete is probably a really good example of how we do that. Traditionally, we've used concrete in a lot of places for National Grid. But more recently, we've started to really focus in on this area and work with our suppliers and our contractors to look at alternative concrete mixes, so low carbon concretes. And other things that we're doing is looking at how we can essentially remove concrete from construction projects, or certain aspects of construction projects entirely. So looking at things or alternatives to things like access roads using soil stabilisation rather than a big concrete access road, which is really powerful and can have a really dramatic impact on the overall embodied carbon within a construction scheme. From an innovation point of view, we do lots of work with universities and research councils across the UK, and you'll know as well, Nikki, obviously we have National Grid Partners now, which is, I guess, our investment innovation arm, so looking at how we can invest in startup technologies and companies and bring a lot of that innovation back to our networks to help with decarbonisation and help with these challenges that we're seeing every day. I think what is interesting when we're talking about this idea of embodied carbon and where we can make the best and most meaningful interventions is where that happens in a project's life cycle, I guess. So we've talked a lot about interventions we can make in the construction phase, but there's this concept of, I guess, a carbon hierarchy or a carbon reduction curve that I know, Christine, you'll probably talk a little bit more about in detail in a minute. And that's really an idea driven about where we can make the most meaningful intervention in a scheme. So we can absolutely make interventions later on in a scheme during construction, but the most meaningful interventions we can make and the most impact we can have on a scheme's carbon footprint is earlier on during design. So starting right in the needs case, do we actually need to build this, and can we challenge the needs case, right through to when we're designing this, can we do this in a better, more sustainable way? So can we change the layout, can we use different equipment? And all of those decisions up front can have really profound impacts on the overall embodied carbon within the scheme. And then eventually we kind of go through to delivery where we've got these kind of bigger interventions around innovation and technology implemented as well.
So one of the things they always talk about when they talk about sustainability, people will say, oh, it costs more money. So by the nature of sustainability, the definition is it has to have a positive impact on the environment, it has to have a positive impact on people. So for us, that's the communities in which we build, our people, our contractors, and it must be financially viable. So if something's more expensive, it's not sustainable. But when we do look at cost, we look at whole life cost. So something might be more expensive initially to purchase, but running that asset is going to be cheaper. So a very simple example is when we do overhead line schemes, we're on site for a year or two, we have a big site set up, we might have 10, 15 quarter cabins. And we might have a big diesel generator running that quarter cabin. And what we're encouraging our contractors to do is have a more suitable generator that is not as diesel, and to use eco cabins. Now, eco cabins are more expensive than your regular cabin to hire, but within the first month, you actually make savings on your energy and your water usage. So yes, it was more expensive to hire up front, but you are making savings. So, as Liam said, when we look at design, we look at where we can make savings throughout the whole life cycle of constructing an asset. So that starts, as Liam said, with your needs case. So the first thing we think about is, can I do nothing or build less? Which sounds a bit simple, but you might think, right, I need a new substation in that area, but do I need a new one, or can I just upgrade an existing one? So that's the first option. The second option is, can I do less? And do less can often mean purchasing less. So we've got a substation in the south, Little Brook, and what it did was it took the equipment from a decommissioned substation and reused. Now that in itself saved thousands of tonnes of carbon, and it also saved several £1 million. So it's building those decisions in the front end of our designs. So we've been training our engineers over the last 6 years to think about this as they're doing the designs. And then we move into the supply chain. So as you know, National Grid doesn't actually do the building, our employees don't do the construction. We employ principal contractors, subcontractors. And what we do is we've incentivised them over the last 5 years to consider carbon. So what happens, we want to construct a new substation, we put out a tender, we get bidders in, and during that bidding process, they have to demonstrate what their carbon footprint will be. So we'll look at our designs, look at theirs, and what the reduction is. Now, over the last 5 years, we've done this in £500 million worth of construction. And we've found that every 10% that the winning bid has reduced their carbon footprint based on our design, they've reduced the cost by 6%. So they are hard figures. So that's now a matter of course for a National Grid, we're including carbon in our tenders. And then when you get into construction phase, there's still savings to be made, as Liam said. Now, at that point, we're working collaboratively with our contractors, and we start to look at good practices around site setup, the materials we use, and we're choosing low carbon options. And low carbon options are cheaper. So yeah, we're making savings throughout the whole life of the scheme. So I talk a lot there about what we're doing with our supply chain, and that's an area we're really interested in expanding. So I mean, Nikki, you've been working really closely with the supply chain, haven't you?
Yeah, so you've hit the nail on the head there, Christine. The supply chain is absolutely essential to the work that we do. And when we talk about the supply chain, who exactly do we mean? So firstly, our principal contractors, they are the constructors. They're the ones actually delivering these large infrastructure asset projects that we've talked about over the course of this talk. And they bring with them their own supply chain as well. But what we've got to realise at National Grid is that we aren't the only ones with these challenges around low carbon construction. There are other infrastructure clients facing it. There are also other supply chain organisations that are delivering the works also facing similar challenges as well. And what it actually does is create a really great environment for us to share ideas and best practice with each other, try and learn from each other. And our supply chain have that bird's eye view of exactly what's happening, what sort of low carbon initiatives are out there taking place that they may have delivered not only for National Grid, but for other organisations as well. And to really create an environment for this, one of the really positive things of this project has been to create a low carbon construction forum where we invite various organisations. So we've had an attendance of about 25 different organisations with up to 40 plus experts in either sustainability or project delivery, all coming together and sharing these ideas and best practice innovations. And perhaps one of the areas where this has worked really well is the low carbon concrete space and the working group associated with that, because there's so much happening in this area. National Grid can't take on the sole task of looking at all of these different low carbon concretes by itself. So we're relying on our supply chain to share data, and again, this goes back to the whole thing around transparency and collaboration to help achieve the project's overall goals of moving towards a low carbon construction future.
Hi, I'm Sarah, Project Supervisor at London Power Tunnels. London Power Tunnels is 32.5 kilometres of tunnel through South London. We're rewiring South London because the existing cables have reached the end of their asset life. So we're tunnelling 40 metres below ground. We're sinking a series of shafts across South London, and then we're lowering 4 tunnel boring machines into the ground.
My name is Gareth Burden. I'm National Grid's Project Director for the London Power Tunnels project. Edith, our tunnel boring machine, had a long journey. Edith weighs 140 tonnes in total. It'll be eating up the ground between here, where we are in Peckham, all the way out towards Brixton, where our journey will finish. It can feel daunting. It's big kit, it's big plant, it's big equipment, but the satisfaction of seeing these things through is the most satisfying thing I've ever had in my career. Infrastructure is great fun.
So the London Power Tunnels project, which has kind of been brought to life a little bit through this video, is a really great example of where National Grid project teams have come together with our suppliers. So in this instance, it was a Hopteeth Murphy joint venture, and probably one of the most positive outputs is the sheer scale of innovative ideas and projects that has come out of this that are currently in delivery. So there was the soil stabilisation technique that you talked about earlier, Liam, which really avoids the construction of roads for haulage or logistics purposes, again saving significantly on carbon. The project has also made really good use of things like solar and hydrogen-powered lighting, trying to use hydro-treated vegetable oils, so HVO fuels, which carry with them a significant reduction in carbon to try and reduce our reliance on diesel generators, which is, again, great. But again, there's positives around this because it's contributing to wider sustainability issues and not only decarbonisation, where sometimes people can get carbon tunnel vision. That's certainly not the case with this project because they've thought about things like the impact on air quality as well through the reduced usage of diesel generators. But perhaps my favourite innovation on the London Power Tunnels project, a subject quite close to my heart, is the use of earth-friendly concrete. Concrete has a significant carbon impact. It contributes to 8% of the world's global emissions, which is absolutely staggering. And the earth-friendly concrete that this project has utilised saves carbon by 90%, which is incredible. So it's really great to see National Grid projects being a leader when it comes to innovations and technologies like these. So what's next, Christine?
So what's next? Well, there's plenty. So we've talked a lot about what National Grid do, and you've talked a lot about the supply chain, which is really important. And then the other thing that we're doing is a lot of collaboration with our peers. So it's really important that we do our bit and our supply chain, but the industry as a whole is actually making great inroads, and we all need to move together, and that's to accelerate the pace of change. So one group that we're a member of is a net zero infrastructure industry coalition. And this was formed by your private and your public infrastructure companies and also academic institutions. And we formed to look at how can we help the industry arrive at net zero. Everybody has a roadmap, everybody has a target, but what are the challenges, what are the obstacles, and how can we work together? So there's several key areas of focus, and one of them was on embedded carbon. And what we set off to do was we got off the government their 10-year programme that they've committed to, projects that are happening in the UK in infrastructure. And we thought, maybe naively, that we could go to these companies and say, oh, can you please tell me how much carbon that's going to be? Then we could get this picture of our 10-year programme, and we could start looking at ways to reduce carbon. Well, after 6 months trying, we could only get 9% of the data. So we recognise that data is a very big issue. So we've been really good at collecting data. It hasn't been easy, but we've done it. So we've been therefore part of another group, and I know, Liam, you've been a major player in this, where we work with the other TOs in Great Britain, the Scottish Power SSE, and we've developed a common methodology for measuring carbon, and we have a common tool. And that tool is going to be publicly available. So all the TOs will now be speaking the same language, and they have that tool available to them. And then that tool can be expanded to other bits of the infrastructure industry. And the supply chain, there's a sustainability supply chain school. They have a calculator which they're trying to widely use. So as an industry now, we're helping each other get over that hurdle of not being able to measure carbon. And then the other area is about the low carbon materials. So as you say, we've been doing loads of concrete, steel, aluminium, but so is everybody else. So is Network Rail, massive use of steel. So there's a group, another coalition called IND4, and that is about decarbonisation, carbonising the industry, and it's sharing good practice, it's looking at all the challenges we face, look at all the opportunities, and we're part of that forum, which is excellent. And then one other forum I'd like to shout out to is MyROG. So MyROG is a major infrastructure resource optimisation group, and that's all about circular economy and reuse. Again, all our other clients are there, and we've been working with them in the areas that we're interested in as well. So to answer your question, what's next? We will continue to do what we do, we will continue to work the supply chain, and we'll continue to collaborate with our peers, because that's how we're going to get change.
That's amazing. You forget, don't you, how much collaboration I think we do. And just thinking back to that video that we saw right at the beginning, that was the key message that came from everybody. The idea of how we can share and collaborate is so important in delivering all of this work. But equally, so is the data. It needs to be data-driven sharing and collaboration. And I think we've got lots of examples of where we've done that. Hopefully, I think we've kind of demonstrated that we've been doing that for a period of time, and we've seen some really tangible results. So looking at where we were 5 years ago to now, the carbon intensity of our projects has gone down by about 30%, and we measure that in tonnes of CO2 per million pounds that we spend, which is a phenomenal amount. There's still a lot to do, and we've got really, really ambitious targets for the next 5 years. But I think there's a good foundation and good base to be able to build on. We've got those networks in place. We're part of the right groups to be able to share where we've made mistakes and where we've done things well. And hopefully, I think the rocket example in terms of sharing carbon data with our transmission, the other TOs in Scotland is a really great example of that, because it's saving them so much time going away and being able to build that database up themselves. They can learn from and build on the work that we've done over the last 5 years, and we can hopefully bring the industry forward together, so that these targets and really ambitious targets that we see in that net zero strategy of where we want to be in the next 5, 10, 15 years, we can build infrastructure in the lowest carbon way possible and enable that decarbonisation of the energy grid, both in terms of generation and as well, which is great.
Excellent.
Cool. great. So I think we've got a few questions now that have come in and we've collated. So the first one I'll chuck over to you, Christine, which is a really interesting one actually. So when did you notice the tide was starting to change when it comes to sustainability? So when did people's interest start to pick up a bit to this issue?
I'd
some of the
say
work we're doing.
there's a few key points that happened in it along since we've been doing this. So we say we've been measuring carbon for 6 years, but we started it 8 years ago. We had a very forward-thinking director of construction at the time, and he actually allowed us to have a team of people looking at sustainability, which 8 years ago was quite novel. So we had one person looking at carbon and actually capturing that carbon footprint in design. Now at the time it wasn't business as usual, so we had to twist a few engineers' arms to say, look, we need this data to see what it's about. So we measured about 200 schemes, and at that point we could say this is a baseline. We knew that this was how many tonnes that we were designing for every £1 million we spend, and we could also put a financial figure on it. So once we've got that data, we then presented it to senior managers. And that was a moment I actually saw light bulbs go on in their eyes, because they thought, money, there's actually money attributed to this. So they said, okay, let's go further. And then from then we started developing the tool, and we actually embedded it in the processes. So we've done that for several years. So it was that buy-in, and at that time was the infrastructure carbon review. So the UK tasked 100 infrastructure companies to look at their relation between carbon and cost, and that's when they said there's a direct relationship. You reduce carbon, you reduce cost. There's 30 companies signed up to pledge that they would look at reducing carbon and their carbon targets. Now, National Grid was one of those companies, and it was John Pettigrew that went along to government to sign. It was very fortunate that the day after he'd been and done this in Parliament, he came around my team. He used to walk around and see what everyone was doing. We were presenting this data to him. And again, I remember the look on his face. He won't remember this at all, from 5 years ago. And he went, I've just been told that you reduce carbon, you reduce cost, and you're actually proving this to me. And that was it. We flew. Wind the clock forward to now, we're principal partners of COP26. So that was the moment where we showed John there is something in this. And then the other times is embedding it in the process. So that sounds really simple, but for example, we have one gateway we go through with investments. There was a checklist of things. For us to get carbon on that checklist took 1 year to jump through the hoops, encourage, to train people. But that again, we got that on that checklist. And then one other final point is we try to measure the carbon footprint of designs in the as-built. So once we construct it, we want to know what was the actual design, then we can compare it to the original design. We built the tool, we put it in processes, we trained hundreds of people, we put it in contracts for contractors, but nobody completed the tool. And the reason is, there's a very large checklist at the end of the project, and obviously we were right at the bottom, and we didn't have priority. Now we chased this for years, and we were really pushing this. And then, the current director at the time was given it as an objective, and his personal objectives to get that carbon footprint. His objective was how much carbon in construction. In that year, we got 84% of these carbon footprints back, because not only did he have it in his objective, he went all the way through the organisation. So for it to embed, sustainability to embed in any organisation, you need to put it as people's day jobs and put it in their objectives, and it was a massive step change.
I think that really nicely links into another question that we've got here, which is, again, I think it's something that we probably don't talk about. We've not touched upon a lot in this book. I'll give this one to you, Nikki. So what do you think the role of leadership is in facilitating the low carbon transition and low carbon construction in your
So people are absolutely, crucial to just making this whole operation work, right? And I'm going to use a quote that I really like from our project sponsor at the time, Emma Ford, who was sort of in that video earlier on, and she said that people are our greatest assets. Even though we build all of these different types of assets, people are the greatest ones. And this, to be honest, having senior leadership talk so openly about the fact that we need to start taking sustainability and carbon seriously is absolutely crucial. But then the other side of the coin is that, it's all in well doing really great things, but if we're not talking about it at all different levels, the message just simply doesn't land. So, if it's only senior leaders talking about it, we need to actually make sure that messaging filters down through to those people that are actually delivering it.
Just building on what you were saying, Christine, about leadership, I think that's a really good point, and it links in quite nicely to another question that we've had, which I'll give to you, Nikki, which is about what's the role of leadership in facilitating low carbon construction, and I guess more widely the low carbon transition in general?
Yeah, so leadership is absolutely crucial to almost showing everyone the way of how to go about essentially doing the right thing. And there's a quote that I really, really like by one of our senior leaders, Emma Ford, who you saw earlier on, who says that National Grid build loads of different types of assets, but people are our greatest assets. And it's these people that are going to be delivering our low carbon ambitions. So it's absolutely crucial that whilst we've got leadership that are saying the right things, encouraging others to do the right things, that we also make sure that this messaging is going all the way down to teams that are on the ground delivering these large infrastructure projects. And I think it's all well doing great things, but we've also got to talk about it and communicate it with all different levels of the organisation. And we've done this in a few different ways. So particularly at kind of C-suite levels, we've had the Contractor CEO Forum where we managed to talk about the low carbon construction project, our strategy, roadmap and targets to an audience of other contractor CEOs as well, which is really great because then they can realise that we're trying to bring these people along on the journey with us. But then more from a delivery perspective, what we've done is we've had the sustainability team engage really heavily with project engineers, investment engineers, talking to them about sustainability, so wider sustainability issues around a responsible business and not only decarbonisation, and also educate them on things like sustainability KPIs and procurement practices. So all of this messaging in comms is absolutely crucial to making sure that the messaging lands right.
I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And a lot of the time, it doesn't need to be badged as sustainability. So when you speak to project engineers, for example, it's stuff they're doing anyway. It's just clever, smart engineering. So building in more efficient ways, using less materials, less resources, and eventually, kind of back to the point you were making about cost, it ultimately comes down to if we build less, it has a commercial benefit for us as a business, as well as being the right thing to do and have a sustainability output as well. So I think that's really important. There's another great question here, which is when we work with our contractors at National Grid on construction projects, with any new innovation, there's always an amount of risk, whether that's small, large, medium. So how do we work with our contractors, I guess, to try and remove this barrier and facilitate adopting new innovation and new technologies, keeping that risk level and that tolerance level as low as possible? So I guess one maybe for you, Christine.
I've got examples when we've done exactly that, yeah. So I would say National Grid didn't really have a risk appetite, but I've seen a real step change in the last few years. So we are willing to look at new innovations. Now, our supply chain are great at bringing them to us, but they can't afford to invest time and money in innovating. They need the backing of clients. So one example I've got is on the Hinkley project again. So there is this process called soil stabilisation. So when we build or repair overhead lines, we have miles and miles of roads we need to create so that our big lorries can get down in our machinery. And the traditional method is to lay natural stone, so it's a natural resource that we're laying. But also it means a community, normally small village, is having to put up with hundreds of trucks going in and out with all these stones. And there's a technology which is not new, it's called soil stabilisation. You take the top layer of soil, you mix it with a product and it creates a hard stand-in. Now, that's been around for years and years, and very often people approach us, why don't we do it? And it's like, well, we need to put that land back for the landowner and he needs to grow on that land. Can we risk that this product hasn't completely destroyed the soil? So it was on the Hinkley project, and it took a very forward-thinking safety and environmental manager to say, okay, I'm going to look into this. So we went with our contractor and to the supplier of this product, loads of research, loads of evidence to look at, okay, should we do this? And we did. And to date, it has absolutely worked. It's reduced cost and it's reduced, it's improved the environment for the people that live around. And what we want to do as National Grid is make that standard. If you want sustainable construction, there needs to be no other option but a sustainable construction. So now we've proved the concept, we can then roll that out across the other areas. SF6, massive emitter. For years and years people said, why don't you find an alternative? But how can we risk putting an alternative in our system? But we've worked with suppliers, etc., innovated, and now we have got a replacement in our substation zone say, and eventually that will go across our network. So there are great pockets of where we've done this, and now with the forums and the collaboration with the clients, there'll be more and more coming along.
And that's really important, isn't it? Kind of that when we learn something, so when we innovate or when we take a technological advancement, if we share that through groups like my role and our low carbon construction working groups and forums, that helps other industries and other companies within our industry to be able to avoid that time lag between us making a decision to invest and actually getting something on the ground. So that's brilliant. So I think that about brings us to the end of this. So thank you very much for joining us for our session we've just done on low carbon construction.
Hope you enjoyed it, and do contact us if you want to hear any more.
Thanks.